This room looks empty, but it isn't. Rooms like this don't stay silent unless they're hiding something. The stories you're about to hear come from people who thought they were alone until the darkness started responding. Some heard breathing, some saw the chair move, and some realized the room was watching them back. Lower the lights. Don't look away, because once you notice what's in the dark, it notices you too.
I've gone back and forth about whether to share this, but I think I need to put it somewhere. This happened when I was a sophomore at school in the Northeast. I won't say which one, and I'm in Kappa. I'm an English major, and I've always taken my academics pretty seriously because I'm trying to get into law school after I graduate. That's relevant context for what I'm about to tell you. Last semester, I enrolled in this upper-level course on English Romanticism. The class was pretty small, maybe 25 students in total, and it was mostly juniors and seniors. There was a professor who led the seminars, of course, but most of the actual teaching was done by the TA during discussion sections. His name was Romer, and yes, that was his real name. I still don't know if it was a first or last name situation, but that's what everyone called him. He was maybe late 20s, kind of lanky, and gave off this I'm in a band but not a good one type of energy. He was kind of just an oddball. Anyway, the class itself was fine. A lot of close reading, a lot of discussion about nature and memory, and all that romantic nonsense. But participation was pretty dead most days. People would just sit there and wait for Romer to fill the silence, which he hated. You could tell it made him uncomfortable. Which was problematic because then he'd start cold calling on people and chirping at them when they clearly didn't know what was going on. There was one guy, though, who always seemed to keep things alive. His name was Luke. He was tall with brown hair, and the only other thing I knew about him was that he was in one of the better frats on campus. He had this way of making jokes at just the right moment, not to be annoying, but to break the tension when things got awkward, and he actually did the reading, which was rare. When he talked, it was clear he knew his stuff, so the humor felt earned. He wasn't trying to be the class clown, he just had a presence. I remember thinking he was smart but kind of goofy. Anyway, since I needed to participate for my GPA, I ended up being one of the only other people who talked regularly. So it was usually me, Luke, and maybe 2 or 3 others carrying the discussion while everyone else zoned out. Romer seemed to appreciate it. He'd nod along when I made a point, and sometimes he'd build on what I said in a way that felt validating. For my first essay, and I remember this vividly, I wrote about ambiguity in Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. It wasn't groundbreaking, but I was proud of it. When I got it back, Romer had written these long, detailed comments in the margins, not just corrections, actual agreement with my ideas. But after that, I noticed things started to shift a bit. Romer began paying more attention to me in class. He'd call on me more often, ask follow-up questions to my answers, make eye contact with me for long periods of time, stuff like that. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. TAs take a liking to certain students all the time. It's not that unusual. But then he started asking me things that felt less academic. I brushed it off though. I had other things going on. Around the same time, I started running into Luke more and more outside of class. Our sorority and his fraternity had a lot of overlap. I think Greek life is mostly stupid, but we were both in, I guess, what you'd consider top houses at our school. So we had a lot of joint mixers, date nights, and just always went to the same parties. And Luke was just always there. So naturally, we just ended up talking more and more, and I started taking a liking to him. After a few weeks of this, he asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime, and I said sure. We went on maybe 3 dates before things progressed. He was sweet, attentive, all the things you'd want. We started sleeping together, and everything felt normal. I wasn't head over heels or anything, but I liked him. It was uncomplicated, low maintenance, and mostly painless. One afternoon after class, I was walking to my car when I saw Luke standing behind the lecture hall, smoking a cigarette with Romer. They were talking like they knew each other, which struck me as weird. I didn't even know Luke smoked. When I asked him about it later, he laughed and said he was just trying to get on Romer's good side so he wouldn't have to try as hard toward the end of the semester. I told him that was kind of pathetic, and he laughed and said he'd take pathetic over a bad grade any day. A few weeks later, when I came back, I noticed his phone was lying next to him on the bed with a YouTube video playing. I know I shouldn't have looked, but curiosity got the better of me. Can you blame me? I'm a college girl in a sorority. The types of guys I'm surrounded by would cause any rational person to develop trust issues. So I went through his phone. I'm not sure what I was expecting to find, but I was definitely not expecting to find a collection of photos of me. And there were a lot of them. Some were more benign. Photos of me going about my day, or studying, or walking to class. But there were others. I'll let you fill in the blanks yourself, but they were, let's just say, suggestive. Some of them were ones I'd sent him, but there were quite a few that I had no recollection of ever taking. I wasn't mad or anything, mostly creeped out. Like, if he had asked me for most of them, I probably wouldn't have been opposed at all. I didn't wake him up that night. I just went back to sleep, not really knowing how to feel. I ended up keeping things to myself, partly because I was embarrassed, but partly because I didn't want him to know I'd snooped through his phone. A week later, after he'd fallen asleep again, I decided to try guessing his password, which actually wasn't too hard. It was just his birthday, but reversed. This time, I went deeper. Brace yourself, because things move really fast from this point forward. I checked his messages, his deleted photos, everything, and I found something horrifying. He'd been sending photos of me, those photos of me, to an unsaved number, regularly for weeks. Basically the entire duration of time we'd been seeing each other. It was sick, and it was probably illegal too, but I couldn't think about that. I was shaking. I took pictures of everything, and then I started to cry. I couldn't control myself. I basically slapped him awake and demanded to know who the number belonged to, and he stumbled through this ridiculous story about how it was just his backup phone, how he liked to have copies of everything in case his main phone got lost. I knew instantly that was bullshit. I stormed out before he could convince me to stay. I was a complete wreck. I was a psychological mess, and I felt gross. I really didn't want to get into the immediate aftermath of everything, so I won't. Just know that it was probably the worst week of my life. The last thing I need is for that trauma to reopen if anyone figures out who I am or anything. So that's another reason I'm keeping the details to a minimum. The unknown number ended up belonging to Romer, my TA. The police got involved, and Luke confessed pretty quickly once they started pressing him. He admitted that Romer had been paying him hundreds of dollars apparently in exchange for photos. The whole thing had been going on since the beginning of the semester, maybe longer. I don't know all the details, and honestly, I don't want to. Luke got expelled from university, and Romer got fired. I'm pretty sure there was jail time involved as well, although I do remember thinking whatever punishment they got wasn't nearly enough to make me feel compensated. That was over a year and a half ago. I'm a senior now, and I'm almost done with school. I'm kind of relieved about that, to be honest. I've dealt with things in my own way, and I won't get into that, but I thought everything was behind me. A few weeks ago, though, I started noticing something. There's this silver sedan that's been parked outside my sorority late at night. Not every night, but enough that I've started paying attention. I haven't seen anyone get in or out of it. I don't know if it's one of them. I'm probably being paranoid, but it's really freaking me out. And honestly, I'm not sure how they'd even know I live here now. I moved into the house well after the Luke situation. Anyway, if anything else happens, I'll update. This happened like 2 weeks ago. I'm still not fully over it, but I need to get it out there because keeping it to myself is driving me insane. My name is Mike, but everyone calls me Mikey. I'm 22, and I'm still living with my parents in Northern California. And before you ask, no, it's not the California you're picturing. I always have to explain this to people. Not every part of the state is beaches and palm trees. Where I live, it snows pretty heavily. We're talking middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest, closest neighbor is a 10-minute drive kind of situation. I've been skiing my whole life, so the cold doesn't bother me. If anything, I prefer it, but that's not really the point. The point is that 2 weekends ago, my parents flew out of the country for a wedding. Some friend of my mom's was getting married in Portugal, and I wasn't invited, but I didn't really care about that. A weekend alone in the house sounded kind of nice. Our house isn't anything special, just your standard 3-bedroom, 1-story, nothing fancy. My parents' room is at one end of the hall, mine is at the other, and there's a guest room in between that we mostly use for storage. The living room and kitchen are in the middle of the house, and the front door opens right into the living room. I'm describing this because it'll be important later. The first night alone was fine. I went to bed around 2 a.m. and passed out pretty quickly. The second night is when everything went wrong. I went to bed around the same time, maybe a little earlier. I remember being more tired than usual, so I knocked out fast. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was the middle of the night. That's pretty irregular for me. I knew something woke me up because I always have to keep my phone on airplane mode when I sleep. So it wasn't that, but I had no idea what it could have been. I scanned the room, but it was pitch black. As my eyes started adjusting to the darkness, though, I saw something strange. My closet door was wide open. I always keep that door closed, always. It's one of those sliding doors that doesn't stay shut on its own, so I make a point of closing it every night before bed. I know that sounds weird, but I've had to think about open closet doors since I was a little kid. The point is, I didn't leave it open. I know I didn't. I started freaking out a little. My brain was doing that thing where it's trying to convince you that you're still dreaming, but I knew I wasn't. I was fully awake. I could feel my heart starting to pound, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really, really wrong. Without thinking, I reached over to my nightstand, grabbed my phone, and turned the flashlight on. I literally screamed when I saw them. There were 2 figures standing at the edge of my bed, just standing there. Before I could make out any features, they scattered in opposite directions like they were trying to avoid the light beam. It was freaky how fast they moved, almost like they knew I had been about to turn the light on. I started flailing my phone around, trying to keep it on them, but they were too quick. I heard something clatter to the floor, but I didn't have time to process it. I just started screaming. I don't even know what I was screaming. I think I was just making noise out of pure panic. The 2 figures bolted from my bedroom door. I heard their footsteps pounding down the hallway, and I started chasing them before I could have a second thought. By the time I got out of bed and made it to the hall, though, I heard the front door slam. I ran to the living room, but they were already gone. I stood there in the living room for I don't even know how long. My hands were shaking, and I was just trying to focus on catching my breath. The moment I regained my composure, I ran back to my room, locked the door, and called 911. While I was waiting for the police in the safety of my locked room, I finally turned the light back on. That's when I looked down at the floor by the edge of my bed and saw what had clattered during the commotion. It was one of my mom's kitchen knives. I almost threw up. I'm not kidding. Those people had been standing over me with a knife while I was sleeping. If I hadn't woken up when I did, I don't even want to think about what would have happened. I probably wouldn't have woken up. The police showed up maybe 20 minutes later. They searched the entire property, but there was no sign of anyone, of course. They took my statement, asked me a bunch of questions, and then one of the officers told me I must have forgotten to lock the front door. I told him I remembered locking it, but he just kind of shrugged and said that was the only explanation, being as there were no signs of forced entry, and every other door and window throughout the entire house was locked. The only thing that even could have been unlocked was the front door. I accepted that and watched them leave, but I knew I locked the front door. Fast forward through the nonsense of my parents getting home the next day and scolding me all over again for forgetting to lock the front door. There's no need to get into that. It's been 2 weeks now, and I still don't have an explanation. Forget whether the door had been locked or not. Why the hell were 2 people in my room with a knife? Just rob the place. It's not like I would have noticed them come and go. At first, I thought whoever broke into my house that night might have known my parents were out of the country, but now I'm starting to doubt that theory, because I have trouble believing standard thieves would go out of their way to kill someone. My name is Natasha. This started happening about 3 months ago, right after I broke up with my ex, Tibbet. I'm 23, and I just moved into my first solo apartment after living with roommates since college. It was nothing special, a 1-bedroom in a mid-sized complex in Columbus, Ohio. I work remote, so I'm home a lot. That's part of why I wanted my own place. I was tired of trying to take calls while my roommates were being loud in the kitchen or whatever. The apartment was on the second floor, facing the back of the complex, which meant my view was basically the parking lot and then some trees. Not exactly scenic, but I didn't care. I had my own space, my own schedule, and for the first time in my adult life, actual privacy. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. I didn't really interact with anyone in the building besides the occasional head nod. There was an older woman on the first floor who always seemed to be checking her mail whenever I walked by, and a couple across the hall who I'd hear arguing sometimes through the walls. That was about the extent of my social landscape. Anyway, I started noticing this guy. The first time was maybe 3 weeks after I moved in. I was coming back from the gym around 8 p.m., and as I was walking up the stairs to my floor, I passed someone coming down. He was this nondescript white guy, maybe late 30s or early 40s. He had an average build. He was also wearing a gray hoodie. There wasn't really anything remarkable about him. We did that awkward thing where you both try to move to the same side, then he just kind of squeezed past me without saying anything. I didn't think much of it. The second time was a few days later. I was in the parking lot getting something out of my car, and I saw him standing near the dumpsters. He wasn't really doing anything, just sort of standing there. When I looked over, he turned and walked away around the side of the building. Again, not that weird on its own. I shrugged it off and went about my business as usual. The third time is when things started feeling off. I was working at my desk, which faces the window overlooking the parking lot. It was the middle of the afternoon, and I happened to glance outside while I was on a call. There was a navy blue car parked in the lot that I didn't recognize, and someone was sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could tell they were looking up at the building, at my floor, maybe at my window specifically, but I couldn't be sure. I watched for a few seconds, then went back to my call. When I looked again, maybe 10 minutes later, the car was gone. For whatever reason, that stuck with me. I started paying more attention after that, and the more attention I paid, the more I noticed him. The guy spent a lot of time in the parking lot, not every day, but often enough that it started to feel like a pattern. Sometimes he'd be walking through, sometimes sitting in that same blue car, which I realized was his a few days later. Once I saw him standing by the stairs to my building, just looking at his phone. He never looked directly at me, or if he did, I never caught him. But I started to get this feeling like he was always positioned in a way where he could see my apartment. I told myself I was being paranoid. The complex isn't that big. If someone lived there and kept similar hours to me, I'd probably see them a lot. That's just math. And I'd never actually caught him doing anything wrong either. He wasn't following me, and he wasn't approaching me. He was just around. But then something happened that I couldn't explain away. I have a pretty set routine. I go to the same gym at the same time most days, and I usually stop at this Chipotle on the way back twice a week. It's like a 15-minute drive from my apartment in a completely different part of town. One night, I'm sitting in the Chipotle eating by myself and scrolling through my phone. I look up, and there he is. That same guy with that same gray hoodie from the first time I saw him. He was just sitting at a table across the restaurant, eating a burrito bowl. I started to feel sick in my stomach, I'm not exaggerating. I felt physically sick for a second, because there was no reason he should be there. The gym I go to is in a different direction. This Chipotle isn't even near anything else. It's not like it's on a main road where you just happen to end up. You go there on purpose. I tried to rationalize it. I mean, Chipotle is pretty popular, and he was eating, but he was also looking at me. Not obviously. He looked down at his food, then glanced up, then looked down again. But I could feel it, and when I got up to leave, I swear he started gathering his stuff too. I walked to my car fast. I didn't run, but I was moving. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a second. When I looked back at the restaurant, I couldn't see him through the windows. I don't know if he came outside or not, but I didn't want to stick around. The drive home, I kept checking the mirrors. I didn't see anyone following me, but I took a weird route just to be safe. It was probably overkill, especially because he already knew where my apartment was, but I wasn't thinking straight. When I got back to my apartment, I sat in the dark for like an hour just watching the parking lot through my window. I never saw either him or that sedan. So eventually, I convinced myself I'd overreacted and went to bed. The next morning, though, I woke up and looked outside like I'd been doing every morning since this started. The sedan was there, and I could see someone sitting in it, so I didn't think twice and just called the police. I felt stupid doing it. What was I gonna say? Something along the lines of, there's a guy who I keep seeing and it's making me uncomfortable. As silly as it sounded, I called anyway, and I tried to explain the situation. The officer I talked to was polite, but clearly thought I was being paranoid. He said they could send someone to check the parking lot, but unless the person was doing something illegal, there wasn't much they could do. He suggested I document things, write down dates and times, take pictures if I could, and call back if anything escalated. By the time a patrol car actually showed up, maybe 45 minutes later, the sedan was gone. The officer walked around the complex, knocked on a few doors, and basically told me what I expected. No sign of anyone suspicious, no complaints from other residents. He gave me a card and told me to call if anything else happened. Nothing happened for about a week after that. I started to relax a little. I figured maybe the police visits had spooked that creep, or maybe I really had been imagining things and my brain just needed to reset. But then I got the note. It was slipped under my door sometime during the night, and I found it in the morning when I woke up. It was a handwritten note that read, "You should really close your blinds at night." I was terrified. I remember dropping the note out of fear before scrambling to pick it back up. My hands were shaking, and I felt a really nasty feeling of danger and helplessness. I ended up moving out 2 weeks later. I didn't even wait for my lease to end. I just paid the penalty and left. I thought that was the end of it. I moved back in with my parents, planning to stay there until I found another apartment, but if that was really the end of it, I probably wouldn't be writing this. About a month after moving back home, I was driving back from the gym, a different gym obviously, one near my parents' place, and that's when I saw it. A navy blue sedan parked on a random side street maybe 2 blocks from my parents' neighborhood. I immediately recognized the car, and I knew it was the same car. I knew it for a fact. I sped the rest of the way home, trying not to freak out. I didn't see anyone following me, but that almost made it worse, because if it was him, and I'm almost positive it was, then he probably already knew where I was going. I told my parents as soon as I got inside. My dad said he'd keep an eye out, and my mom started double-checking all the locks. They've been watching the street more carefully since then, and my dad even mentioned getting a camera for the front porch. It's been about 2 weeks, and I haven't seen that car since. Part of me wants to believe it was a coincidence, that it was just a similar car and I'm losing my mind, but I know what I saw. I don't even know how he found me, but I really don't want to think about the possibility that I have a dedicated stalker who's been tracking everything I do. I'm quite honestly scared to do anything that involves leaving the house. I'm debating getting the police involved again, but there's not much I'd be able to even tell them. Hopefully this story needs no updates. This is gonna sound weird, but bear with me. When I was in high school, there was a kid who told everyone he was a demon. I don't feel comfortable even writing his name for reasons you'll soon understand. I'm just gonna call him Patrick, even though his name sounds like something out of a Shakespeare play. He was extremely socially awkward and walked around with this super empty stare that made even teachers uncomfortable. He wore the same blank gray hoodie literally every single day. I'm not exaggerating. I'm pretty sure he never washed the thing since he always smelled terrible too. He was decently short and pretty average looking, although you wouldn't be able to tell since he always had his hood up. He never took his sunglasses off, even inside. Teachers eventually stopped asking him to because he would never listen anyway. Now comes the weird stuff. He didn't have any friends, but had this weird tendency to adopt people. What I mean by that is, if he liked you, which he could decide randomly one day, he would walk up to you and say, "You're adopted," meaning you were part of his circle or whatever. Apparently this would make you safe from him or something. That's at least what he'd say about it. He didn't really like that many people though, so few people were ever really adopted. I was one of those few. Looking back, it was probably because he had a crush on me. None of us believed his demon spiel, and everyone just assumed he was a troubled kid, which he definitely was. Oh yeah, I should probably mention that this all takes place in Wayne, Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up. Another girl I used to be friends with, Gabby, had also been adopted by him. Patrick's crush on her was a little more obvious, and all my friends knew it. One day, my friends and I were chilling on the dugouts behind our high school, killing time and doing God knows what. It was me, Gabby, Laura, and Luke. I can't exactly remember how it happened, but the topic of conversation floated over to Patrick's crush on Gabby. We were all laughing about it, and Gabby was pretty obviously embarrassed. I can't remember what it was, but there was a nickname we'd substitute for Patrick's name, because his real name was too clunky. This time though, I distinctly remember Laura using Patrick's real name. The third time she said it, I swear in my life that Patrick appeared out of nowhere and jumped on top of the dugout with a baseball bat in his hand. It wasn't scary in a typical sense, but it was one of the most unsettling things I'd ever seen up until that point. We quickly stopped talking, nervous that he might have overheard us talking about him. He didn't say anything though, and just stared at us. I gave him a little wave, and he nodded in acknowledgement at me before jumping back down to the ground and swiftly walking away. After we were sure he was gone, the four of us burst into laughter, finding humor in how weird the whole encounter was. On the inside though, I was still a little disturbed. The next incident I can remember was significantly more creepy and impossible to laugh about. I was literally in Laura's house, and the two of us were hanging out in her room. Her parents were home. I'm not sure what exactly we were talking about, but again, Patrick's name was said 3 times between the two of us. Not 10 minutes later, we heard Laura's front door slam shut. Confused, we went downstairs to see if one of our other friends had decided to pull up. Laura was friends with everyone and her parents were super chill, so people came and went unannounced when it came to her house. Laura's mom had beaten us to the door though. We turned the corner of the living room and stared in shock at Patrick, who was just standing there, talking to Laura's mom. She asked him what he was doing there, to which he literally replied, "I was summoned." Laura's mom made some small talk with him before politely asking him to leave, which he silently did. The reason why more alarm bells weren't going off was because Laura's mom actually knew Patrick and pitied him. Laura and I weren't as calm about the situation though. As we walked back up the stairs, we talked to each other with horrified faces about how creepy that was. A few minutes later, we made the connection between the two events. He seemed to pop up when his name was uttered 3 times. I know how ridiculous this sounds, but we had both witnessed 2 unexplainable events and knew Patrick's history of claiming to be a demon. How else could someone else rationalize what had taken place? We told all of our friends about the incident the next day, and our friend group swore to never say his name 3 times in one conversation again. Things were going well for a few months, and I started to think that maybe I had overreacted. That is, until one day, when my same group of friends were hanging out at my other friend Johnny's house. We were chilling on his back deck when the topic of conversation again found itself concerning Patrick. Despite all of our efforts to convince him, Johnny refused to believe what we told him about Patrick. Even after confirming the story with the entire group, he was still skeptical. To display his disbelief, he jokingly used Patrick's name 3 times in the same sentence, to our dismay. When nothing happened, he grinned and told us we were stupid to believe something so ridiculous. As annoyed as I was, part of me was relieved that he hadn't shown up. I spoke too soon though, because a few minutes later, Patrick jumped over Johnny's backyard fence. Johnny noticed him first and stopped speaking mid-sentence. The rest of us followed suit and went dead silent, nervous about what Patrick might do this time. We watched as he stared at us for a few seconds before jumping back over the fence and disappearing out of sight. Johnny started freaking out and accused us of conspiring with Patrick to scare him. We told him that we literally begged him not to say anything. We sat in silence for a while before Johnny eventually told us all to go home, clearly shaken from the experience. The last experience I had concerning Patrick was definitely the scariest and most disturbing. It was the only one where I felt like my life might have actually been in danger. A few months after the incident at Johnny's house, I was home alone one night. My parents rarely left the house back then, so this was a rare occurrence. I decided to take advantage of the situation and invited a boy over whom I'd been talking to. He was kind of a tool, but so were most of the guys I was talking to at that age. We were hanging out in my room, and it was lightly raining outside. After a while, he mentioned something about Patrick, which made me visibly cringe. He got confused, so I explained the situation to him. He burst out laughing and told me he was going to say Patrick's name to scare me. I begged him not to, but he did it anyway. Only this time, he didn't just say it. He literally screamed Patrick's name 3 times at the top of his lungs. There was no delay this time. The moment he finished yelling, I could hear the rain instantly pick up outside. A few seconds later, there was a flash of lightning. I started to freak out. The guy I was with actually seemed sorry and told me it was probably just an extremely unlikely coincidence. I cursed him out and ran to my window to look at the storm. I glanced down to look at my driveway and screamed when I saw a silhouette of a person looking up at my window. It was too dark and stormy to know for sure, but I was 99% certain that it was Patrick. I shut the blinds and rushed downstairs to make sure all the doors were locked. After locking the back door, I saw that person again. Only this time, he was standing motionlessly in my front yard. I felt a panic attack coming on, and I knew Patrick was going to find a way inside my house. I started screaming, "But I'm adopted," over and over again, hoping that would do something. I know there was no way he'd have been able to hear me, but my brain was all over the place at that point. The guy I was with ran down the stairs a few seconds later and picked me up off the kitchen floor in an attempt to comfort me. I looked out the window again, and he was gone. The storm was still coming down like crazy though, but it's not like I was going to search the property anyway. The next morning, after that guy had left, I went out to inspect my yard. To my horror, I found something sinister in the far corner of my backyard. It was Patrick's hoodie, and wrapped inside of it were a couple random belongings of mine that I assumed I lost. My parents were gone another day, and I was too scared to call the police. I figured I'd show my parents what I had found after school the next day, and they'd take it from there. I never had to, though. The next day, Patrick didn't show up to school. He didn't show up the day after that either. None of us ever saw him again, and no one knew what happened to him. My parents still live in the same house, which is something I think about a lot. I know this isn't your typical scary story, but I'm not sure where else to vent about this. A few people from school told me they caught Patrick hiding and eavesdropping on their conversations, which could explain how he was able to show up out of nowhere. As I've grown older and thought back on the whole thing, I think what makes the most sense is Patrick was just a mentally ill stalker who followed me and possibly other girls around, hence why he was always able to appear when his name was brought up. It skeeves me out just imagining him following me around all over the place, listening to me. I don't even want to wonder where he is today. I'm from Denver. This happened a few years ago. My friend Mike and I were heading to a dinner party one snowy Saturday evening. We decided to stop at a liquor store before heading to the party. It was honestly a pretty annoying detour with the snow coming down, but we didn't want to show up completely empty-handed. We picked out some local craft beers and a bottle of whiskey and made our way back to the car. I remember the snow started to pick up around then, but it was nothing we weren't used to. He ran back into the liquor store to grab a pack of Zins, his latest nicotine fixation. I remember being annoyed about that because I was the one driving and didn't have the best car for the snow at the time. After a few minutes, he emerged from the liquor store and hopped in the car. I immediately pulled out of the parking lot and we were back on our way. The snow was falling even heavier now, covering the roads in a thick blanket of white. The drive to the party was supposed to be straightforward, about 20 to 30 minutes through familiar suburban neighborhoods. Things in my life are never as easy as they seem though. The snowstorm had other plans, turning what was supposed to be a relaxing route into a treacherous journey. Let me just say, I'm not a great driver as is, and the car slipping every 10 seconds didn't help matters. After a tense few minutes driving uphill, I turned a corner and was met with a sight no one ever wants to see. In the middle of the street was a stopped car. Its hazards were flashing ominously, cutting through the falling snow like distress signals. Both the driver's and passenger side doors were open. I was tempted to just drive around it and continue on my merry way, but Mike instructed me to stop. Judge me if you want, but I'm not your typical Good Samaritan. I've been through way too much BS in my life that has ultimately resulted in a distrust in strangers I typically default to. I told him we were late, but he urged me to stop with a concerned voice. Mike had gotten me into trouble before with his childlike curiosity, but this was different. Someone could be in trouble. Reluctantly, I stopped the car, and the two of us sat in emotionless silence for a few seconds. Mike asked if we should check it out, which I told him was what we were doing. He rolled his eyes and told me watching the car from through the windshield wasn't going to accomplish anything. He was kind of right. I really didn't want to get out of the car though. Nervous about the situation, I asked him if he'd just wait a few more minutes, which he reluctantly agreed to. We sat there watching the eerie blinking of the hazards against what was otherwise a beautiful snowy backdrop. Nothing happened, which I was kind of surprised by. Eventually, Mike said he had had enough and was going to investigate. Before I could stop him, he stepped out of the car. I watched with a rising sense of apprehension as he approached the vehicle. As he was doing so, I could have sworn I saw something dark move out of the corner of my eye. It might have been my worried mind playing tricks on me, but this situation was seeming worse and worse to me every second that passed. Not even 10 seconds later, I thought I saw the car jolt a little, like something had moved in the trunk or back seat. Again, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but I didn't care. I made a quick-time decision and slammed on the horn, startling Mike, who had been inspecting the inside of the vehicle. He understood what I was communicating and sprinted back to the car. I drove off immediately and told him my suspicion that the whole thing was a trap. He was pretty annoyed when I told him I didn't have any actual proof, but I responded in a firm voice that I wasn't going to risk my life for someone who could easily call for help. The rest of the drive was pretty tense, to be completely honest. He was the type of guy to hold a grudge longer than most. We arrived at the dinner party and things were finally normal again. We were there for several hours, and Mike and I had all but forgotten what happened earlier. After a nice dinner and an enjoyable time catching up with old friends, our host turned on the TV to give some departing guests an update on the snowstorm. He flicked over to the local news, and what I saw was actually horrifying. The police were issuing reports of a stolen vehicle that had been jacked not even 2 hours earlier. They were circulating a spoken account from the victim, which went something like this. A woman was driving her teenage son home from a friend's house when she noticed a car in the middle of the road, hazards on and doors open. The two approached the car to see if someone was in distress, and as they did, 2 men sprung out from behind a snowbank and another emerged from the trunk of the vehicle. They held the woman at gunpoint and forced her to turn over her keys. They promptly sped off with the stolen car, along with the one that had been used in the trap. I stared at Mike with a look of pure fear. That could have been us. The two of us told the rest of the party what happened earlier, and that quickly put a damper on the general atmosphere, but people were eating the story up. The worst thing about this experience is that I'm even more distrusting of strangers than I previously was. I often think about how many people I would have otherwise helped out in a time of need had I not experienced such a meticulous trap. The series of events I'm about to recount happened over 30 years ago, during my early childhood. Forgive me if some details are shaky, but I'll try to remember as much as possible. I was around 10 years old. My extended family was massive. At that age, it was hard for me to remember the faces of all my relatives, let alone their names. At every family gathering, I was introduced to someone whose face I didn't recognize, even though they all seemed to recognize me. My dad was one of 9 children, so I had 8 sets of aunts and uncles on his side alone. My grandparents on my dad's side were extremely well off and had a massive beachfront property, which was communal along my dad and his siblings. I don't know its exact dimensions, but I'm pretty sure I could sleep over 30 people. Because of this, my family would often spend entire chunks of the summer down there. Both my parents had jobs that allowed them to either work remotely or spend a lot of time away from their offices. My dad's siblings and their kids would do the same. There was rarely a time when it was just our family at the beach house. I got along with all my cousins, and preferred spending time at the beach house rather than at home since I was closer with some of my cousins than any of my hometown friends. I liked a lot of my aunts and uncles too. My favorite by far was Uncle Joseph, who was the father of my cousin Brandon. Brandon was honestly kind of antisocial, and we didn't really play that much together. Uncle Joseph was awesome though, and he'd never fail to brighten my mood or make me laugh. In addition to being great with kids, he was a licensed therapist and psychiatrist, and was often who I'd turn to in times of need. There's a decent chance he knew more about me than my parents did. I confided in him regularly, and there was nothing I was uncomfortable divulging. Anyway, that summer, I began having tremendously graphic and disturbing nightmares. As far as I can recall, there weren't any common themes between them. They'd all just be about something psychologically taxing, like a family member dying or being alone forever, or something along those lines. I wish I could provide more details, but I've long since purged my mind of those horrors. I do remember one dream distinctly, though. It was one of those false awakening dreams. I woke up and went downstairs to meet my parents for breakfast, like I do on a typical morning. When I got downstairs, though, they weren't in the kitchen, and there was no food on the dining room table. I ran back upstairs and barged into my parents' and then siblings' rooms, but no one was there. The rest of the dream was basically me crying on my bedroom floor, wondering why everyone had abandoned me. After 3 or 4 of those nightmares in a row, I decided to tell my Uncle Joseph out of embarrassment of telling my parents. He listened with a concerned look on his face as I described the kinds of things I was experiencing, and he even started writing things down in his little notebook. He instructed me to do some meaningful internal self-reflection as something was clawing at my subconscious. What kind of self-reflection was I supposed to do, though? I was 10 years old. He told me he'd mull things over, and that I should come back to him if the problem persisted. Of course, it did. A few days and nightmares later, I gave Uncle Joseph an update. He told me he'd been thinking about the situation, and that he had figured out what was going on in my brain. He said that even though I didn't think it, I was deeply frustrated with my parents and was harboring some unresolved resentment towards them. I was more confused than I've ever been. I was nothing if not a well-behaved, polite, grateful kid. I had always listened to my parents and loved them more than anything. Uncle Joseph knew what he was talking about, though. He was a therapist after all. I assumed he had dealt with similar situations in the past and considered myself lucky that he was helping me. I asked him how I should proceed with everything, and told him this newfound knowledge kind of scared me. He told me it was perfectly normal that I was scared, and that most of his adult patients react in the same way. He then told me it was also normal that I disagreed with what he was saying, since dreaming implies a subconscious feeling that the brain refuses to accept. That did kind of make sense to me. He told me that in the next few days, I should be slightly more disobedient when it came to my parents. He told me to try saying no more often, and to argue with them when I didn't get my way. So that's what I did. For 3 days after talking to him, I behaved so uncharacteristically that my parents got concerned. They told me they didn't like my recent behavior, and I'd better quit it. It killed me to do that to them, but I couldn't stand having nightmares literally every night. My 10-year-old self would have done anything to put an end to those night terrors. They didn't stop, though. In fact, they actually got worse. More graphic, more disturbing, and more vivid. It was too much. I confided in Uncle Joseph again, and he told me there was one more thing we could try. I begged him to tell me what it was, but he seemed hesitant. After a few minutes of pleading, he revealed what the thing was. He said my brain was too mature for my young body and that I needed to set it free. Obviously, I had no idea what he meant by that. He told me if I had one more nightmare, he'd tell me what I had to do. I went to sleep, terrified that night. I didn't want to set my body free, even if I didn't know what he was talking about. That night, I actually woke up before having a nightmare. In the several days that this had been going on, I had never woken up before having a nightmare. This was new. For some reason, though, I was scared to move or even breathe loudly. It wasn't sleep paralysis, but I was scared out of my mind. I stared at the wall in that same position for a full minute, not quite sure what I was doing. The next thing I heard was something I will never forget, no matter how hard I try. Whispering, right next to my ear. Uncle Joseph's whispering. I was sure of it. I turned over and screamed, which sent him flying back. He quickly left the room and shut the door. I sat there in a cold sweat. Part of me thought I was still having a nightmare. Instead of going back to sleep, I ran to my parents' room and told them everything. I told them about the nightmares, about Uncle Joseph, about everything. My dad didn't waste a second. He stormed into Uncle Joseph's room and confronted him. My uncle obviously denied everything, but my dad was a big dude and could easily push him around. A fight broke out between them, and my dad snatched the satchel Uncle Joe carried everywhere. Uncle Joseph promptly gathered up his things and basically ran to his car. My dad started going through the satchel, and what he found was sickening. There were pages and pages of dream-related things, both handwritten notes and printed articles. Articles about inducing dreams, specifically nightmares. Personal notes about different techniques, previous data, and types of experiments. It was horrific. Uncle Joseph was eventually arrested, as the police found some even more suggestive things on his computer. I'm not going to go into full detail, but I'm sure you could piece together what they found based on Uncle Joseph wanting to set my body free. I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him long term, since my parents never liked talking about the situation, at least around me. Sometimes I kick myself for being so naive about the whole thing, but there's nothing I can do about that now.